bit different this time around, and yes, it's true that we have some new software that we're working on right now. But I have a really important message that I want to share with you today regarding legislative pay, because this is becoming kind of a big issue here in the state of Idaho, and it's one that we do want to tread a little bit carefully on. And on the other hand, in other words, we don't want to throw our legislators under the bus, but on the other hand, we don't want to try to suggest that, hey, as far as the taxpayers are concerned, we are a limitless resource, and anything you want, you just ask for it, legislators. So the concern that a lot of people are expressing is, well, is legislative pay keeping up with, the demands of the job, the cost of living, and hey, I think we can all relate to the whole cost of living and that part going up. Nonetheless, how do we find an equitable place that to make sure that our legislators are being compensated for time that they spend away from family, away from business, away from home, and yet they don't somehow morph into essentially professional full-time legislators who basically are there to get the perks and the pay from the taxpayers by basically creating busy work for themselves. That's the danger. And it really comes down to incentives. I was reading an op-ed by Ron Nate, who is the president of the Idaho Freedom Foundation, and he talks about a time when he was a legislator. One of the things that I found that was so effective in his message was he said, there were parts of that job that were very difficult. For instance, he spent a lot of time answering every phone call, every email, personally. Now you might think, well, if it's such an important job, why don't we give them all a big professional full-time staff? I mean, we tend to think in terms of what we see on the part of our federal legislators. And granted, the federal government is a much bigger, I would say much more bloated entity. But Ron brings up something that I think sometimes is overlooked, and that is to be a legislator, particularly at the state level, is to be a public servant. Now, that term for some people, brings to mind, well, then they should be step and fetching it for everything that we, tell them to do, and we should be able to abuse them, and there's nothing they can say about it. I don't think that quite fits the term of a public servant. But one thing that I will say about a public servant is that a person who is serving the public in that way, at some level, is sacrificing. And frankly, I would be much happier to see our political office holders back at a place where it is a degree of sacrifice. In other words, they should be reluctant to serve in elected office because it means they're going to be sacrificing deeply at some level. So, with that in mind, I would ask you to consider some of the reasons that Ron Nate gives as to why we don't need to overthink, but at the same time, we don't need to overpay our legislators. He says, first of all, we need to remember that Idaho's legislature is modest and accessible. And I think this is one of the key things. Yes, your congressman or your senator, they're out there serving the people too. But have you ever tried to book an appointment? I'm just going to say with your United States senator. I'm not saying it can't be done, but I'm going to say it's a lot easier and you will find much greater access if that senator, or more importantly, his staff, knows that when you show up to meet him, there's going to be a six-figure check or something in your hand, as many of the lobbyists will have, or the organizations that send those lobbyists out to meet with them. I think it was the Pew Research Center back in 2015 that did a poll asking how much the average citizen can affect public policy. And they're talking primarily through being able to meet with and influence our legislators. And I don't mean to discourage you, but really, it was very little. Now, the exception to that is what happens at the local and at the state level. When you have legislators who are connected to their constituents and who are continuing to work as true public servants, then you're not going to shy away from the idea of, well, we need to be compensating these folks. We need to make sure that their pay is fair. But at the same time, it needs to be modest. And in the case of Idaho's legislature, that is a justified discussion because it is a part-time legislature. The legislator's pay is roughly the national average of what someone would make as a part-time legislator. In other words, it's been fair and reasonable. Essentially, you're talking about roughly a 3-month salary. And outside of that legislative work, it's expected that those legislators will have work to do in their own homes or their own communities. And so some of them may be retired, but again, it's not supposed to be a full-time job. Now, it was a 43% increase that had been proposed. The committee met last week and it came back recommending a 22% raise, about half of what the leaders had proposed, but still way too large. And the question that Ron Nate asks, and I think this is the one worth passing on, is would a significant sudden boost in pay make our legislators either more or less likely to oppose bigger government, to lower your taxes, and to make Idaho freer? He says, I suggest that the history would show that the answer is probably less so. So it's less likely they would adhere to smaller government if you're paying them or adding incentive for them to be there more of the time and to put more of their focus on their job as legislators. This is one of the reasons why we really don't want full-time legislators either. You make a job lucrative and self-sustaining, as Ron puts it, and you're going to see a lot more career-type politicians, which unfortunately seems to attract exactly the wrong person into public service. Again, it would be better to see a person go into public service somewhat reluctantly, knowing that the time that they spend serving their fellow servants is actually going to be a bit of a sacrifice on their part. So with that in mind, I would say just remember, I think we pointed this out in an earlier broadcast last week. When you look at the highest paid state legislators, and that would be in New York and California, would you like to live under New York state government or California state government, given that they have the highest paid and full-time, legislators with many, many staff members for each one of them? Probably not. So give our legislators regular cost of living raises, but Ron says keep the current pay structure with cost of living increases to keep them connected to their servants. And I love how he puts this. He says, let's keep Idaho's legislature modest, connected, and dare I say, humble. Okay, that's a key point right there. Now, I know that, some people, well, money isn't what's going to spoil them, but again, this is an issue that's important enough that we probably should have a good solid take on it, but don't get wrapped around the axle. You don't need to punish your legislators. You don't need to throw them under the bus just because, you don't agree that they don't need more pay. Understand what they do is real work. It requires a great deal of time and not a small amount of self-sacrifice, but let's think twice before we provide incentives that might tempt some to want to become full-time professional legislators, because the costs are only going to go up from there. And I'm not just talking about their salary. I'm talking about, what happens to your pocketbook and what happens to your freedom when they do go full-time. Thanks for joining us. I'm Brian Hyde, and this is Nowhere to Hide.